In the unforgiving Arizona Territory of 1879, where blood feuds between Apache tribes and settlers painted the desert red, one man's act of mercy would echo across a decade. Thomas Bennett never imagined that saving a terrified 8-year-old girl from the aftermath of a cavalry massacre would alter the course of his entire life. 10 years later, that same child would return as a woman, crossing cultural boundaries and defying every social convention of the frontier. What happened between them would challenge everything the town believed about duty, honor, and the choices we make when our hearts refuse to listen to reason. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Arizona Territory in 1879 was not a land for the weak-hearted. It was a place where the sun bleached bones white within days, where water meant the difference between a thriving ranch and a graveyard of dreams, and where the tension between two worlds, Apache and settler, crackled in the air like lightning before a storm. Thomas Bennett had arrived in this harsh country 7 years earlier with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a determination to carve out something of his own. He'd left Missouri after his father's death, tired of working land that would never belong to him, tired of living in the shadow of his older brother's inheritance. The West promised opportunity, and Thomas was willing to pay whatever price the desert demanded. His ranch sat in a valley 20 miles southeast of the growing settlement that would one day be called Prescott. It wasn't much: a sturdy cabin built from ponderosa pine, a barn that housed 6 horses, and grazing land that stretched across 200 acres of scrub grass and rocky terrain. 300 head of cattle bore his brand, a simple TB enclosed in a circle. Every animal, every fence post, every nail in the barn represented sweat and sacrifice. Thomas was 30 years old, though the desert sun and hard living had etched lines around his eyes that made him look older. He stood just over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders built from years of manual labor. His hair was the color of sand, kept short for practicality, and his eyes were a pale blue that seemed to reflect the endless Arizona sky. He was a quiet man by nature, not given to idle conversation or social gatherings. The few neighbors within riding distance respected him for his fairness and his willingness to help when cattle strayed or when someone needed an extra hand during branding season. Unlike many of the settlers who'd pushed into Apache territory, Thomas held no particular animosity toward the native people. He'd seen them from a distance occasionally, small groups moving through the hills, hunters tracking deer through the canyons. Once he'd found an Apache arrow embedded in a tree near his northern property line, and he'd left it there as a marker, a silent acknowledgement that this land had belonged to others long before he'd claimed it. The relationship between the Apache tribes and the encroaching settlers was complicated, written in blood and broken promises. The Chiricahua, Mimbres, and White Mountain Apache had watched their hunting grounds shrink year by year as miners, ranchers, and farmers arrived in increasing numbers. The United States government had established reservations, drawing arbitrary lines on maps and declaring that the Apache must confine themselves within these boundaries. But the Apache were not a people who accepted confinement easily. Their culture was built on movement, on following the seasons and the game, on ranging across vast territories that had sustained their ancestors for generations. The reservations offered little game, poor soil, and inadequate water. Government rations were often late or insufficient. Corruption among Indian agents meant that supplies promised by treaty rarely materialized. In response, some Apache groups left the reservations, returning to their traditional ways of life. They hunted in the mountains, gathered mesquite beans and acorns, and yes, sometimes raided settlements and ranches for cattle and horses. From their perspective, they were simply taking what they needed to survive from people who had taken everything from them. The U.S. Army saw it differently. Raids meant military response. Cavalry patrols crisscrossed the territory, tasked with forcing the Apache back onto reservations by whatever means necessary. The soldiers were often young men from the east who knew nothing of the land or the people they were fighting. They were hot, miserable, and scared, operating in terrain where every rock and canyon could hide an ambush. Their commanders issued orders to pursue and engage hostile Apache groups, but in practice, distinguishing between hostile warriors and peaceful families proved difficult and often irrelevant to men seeking to prove their worth in combat. Atrocities occurred on both sides. Apache warriors killed settlers and soldiers. Cavalry units massacred women and children. The cycle of violence fed itself, each act of brutality justifying the next, until the original causes became lost in a fog of rage and revenge. Thomas tried to stay out of it. He kept to his ranch, minded his cattle, and avoided taking sides in a conflict that seemed to have no solution. When men in town spoke of cleaning out the Apache problem, he remained silent. When he encountered Apache hunters in the far reaches of his property, he simply nodded and went about his business. He wasn't naive enough to think this made him safe, but he refused to contribute to the bloodshed. The town closest to Thomas's ranch was a rough collection of buildings that served as a supply center for the surrounding ranches and mines. It had no official name yet, though people had taken to calling it Granite Creek, after the waterway that ran through it during the spring snowmelt. The town consisted of a general store, a blacksmith shop, a livery stable, a boarding house that doubled as a saloon, and a small church that a Methodist circuit preacher visited once a month. The people who lived in and around Granite Creek were a mix of fortune seekers, veiled farmers trying to start over, former soldiers who'd stayed after their enlistments ended, and a handful of families genuinely trying to build something permanent. They were bound together by their shared struggle against the harsh environment, and by their common identity as Americans bringing civilization to what they saw as wilderness. Their views on the Apache reflected the prejudices of the era. Most saw the native people as obstacles to progress, savages who needed to be subdued or eliminated so that the territory could be properly settled. A few held more nuanced views, acknowledging that the Apache had legitimate grievances. But even these sympathetic voices generally agreed that the native people would need to abandon their traditional ways and assimilate into American society. Church services, when they occurred, reinforced the notion that the settlers were engaged in righteous work. The circuit preacher, Reverend Jonathan Caldwell, spoke of manifest destiny and the Christian duty to bring light to dark places. His sermons emphasized order, proper behavior, and the importance of maintaining clear boundaries between civilized society and what he termed the pagan wilderness. Women in the settlement were expected to embody virtue and domesticity. They raised children, maintained households, and provided moral guidance to the community. A woman's reputation was her most valuable possession, and any hint of impropriety could destroy her standing. The few single women in the area were carefully chaperoned, and marriages were often arranged with practical considerations foremost. A good match meant a partnership that could withstand the challenges of frontier life. Men were judged by their ability to provide, protect, and maintain order. A successful man controlled his property, his household, and his emotions. Displays of weakness were scorned. Men who couldn't hold their liquor, who failed to defend their honor, or who showed excessive sentiment were viewed with suspicion. Into this rigid social structure, Thomas Bennett existed as something of an outlier. He was successful enough to be respected, strong enough to be left alone, but too solitary to be fully trusted. He attended church services when he made the trip to town, but he didn't participate in the social gatherings afterward. He was polite to the women, but showed no interest in courtship. He drank sparingly and never caused trouble. People weren't quite sure what to make of him. Bennett's a strange one, folks would say. Keeps to himself too much. A man his age should be thinking about a wife, about building something that'll last beyond his own lifetime. But Thomas had his reasons for staying alone. He'd seen what happened to families out here, He'd helped bury a neighbor's wife who died in childbirth, the nearest doctor 3 days' ride away. He'd watched children sicken with fever and seen parents helpless to save them. He'd witnessed what grief did to strong men, how it hollowed them out and left them going through the motions of living without really being alive. No, Thomas told himself, better to stay alone. Better to risk only your own life, to have no one depending on you, no one to fail. It was a lonely philosophy, but it kept him safe from the worst kind of pain. The spring of 1879 brought unusual rainfall to the territory. The desert bloomed with wildflowers, Mexican gold poppies, lupines and brittlebush, transforming the brown landscape into a carpet of purple and gold. The cattle fattened on new grass, and waterholes that had been dry for years filled again. It seemed like a good omen, a sign that perhaps the land was ready to be more generous with those who worked it. But the rain also meant something else. The improved grazing conditions drew Apache groups back into areas they'd abandoned during the drought years. Hunting parties ranged farther, following deer and pronghorn herds. Families moved out of the overcrowded reservations, seeking the traditional spring camping grounds in the mountains. The army responded with increased patrols. New orders came down from the territorial commander. Any Apache found off reservation without permission were to be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. The definition of dealt with was left deliberately vague, giving field commanders wide latitude in their methods. Lieutenant Marcus Hensley was 24 years old and fresh from West Point when he received command of a 40-man cavalry unit stationed at Camp Verde. He was eager to prove himself, ambitious for the kind of military glory that could launch a political career back east. The Apache represented opportunity to him, a chance to demonstrate decisive leadership and gain the commendations that would speed his promotion. His men were a mix of veterans and recruits, ardent frontiersmen and boys who'd lied about their age to join the army. They lived in conditions that were barely better than the people they were sent to control: inadequate rations, brutal heat, and the constant stress of potential combat. They took their frustrations out in the only way available to them, following orders with an enthusiasm that often exceeded what was actually commanded. Thomas knew none of this on the morning of June 14, 1879. He woke before dawn, as was his habit, and spent the early hours checking his stock and repairing a section of fence that coyotes had damaged while trying to get at a calf. The work was meditative, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, while his mind wandered through plans for expanding his herd and maybe building a better irrigation system for the vegetable garden behind his cabin. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed into the 90s. Thomas decided to ride out to the canyon on his northern boundary to check on a spring that fed into a natural tank where his cattle drank. The spring sometimes got blocked with debris after heavy rains, and he wanted to make sure the water was flowing properly. He saddled Copper, his reliable bay gelding, and packed a canteen and some jerky in his saddlebag. The ride would take about 2 hours each way. He'd be back by evening with plenty of time to tend the horses and fix himself dinner. The land between his ranch and the canyon was a mix of grassland and scattered juniper trees. Copper picked his way carefully around patches of prickly pear cactus and the occasional cholla. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals in search of rabbits. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the horses' hoofbeats, and the endless whisper of wind through dried grass. Thomas was about a mile from the canyon when he heard the gunfire. The shots came in rapid succession, the distinctive crack of Army Springfield rifles, a sound Thomas had learned to recognize during his brief service years ago. His stomach tightened. Those weren't warning shots or hunting fire. That was sustained combat or something worse. Copper's ears flicked backward, sensing his rider's tension. Thomas urged him forward, not at a full gallop that might announce his presence, but at a quick trot that covered ground while keeping them relatively quiet. As they drew closer to the canyon rim, the gunfire intensified, then abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was somehow more ominous than the noise had been. Thomas dismounted about 100 yards from the canyon edge, tying Copper to a sturdy juniper where the horse would be hidden from casual view. He moved forward on foot, staying low, using the scattered rocks and brush for cover. His rifle stayed in its saddle scabbard. Whatever was happening ahead, he had no intention of getting involved in a fight. He just needed to know what had occurred so close to his property. The smell hit him first. Smoke, sharp and acrid, mixed with something else he didn't want to identify. He crawled the last 20 feet to a rocky outcrop that overlooked a small box canyon below. What he saw made bile rise in his throat. The canyon had sheltered a small Apache camp, perhaps 3 or 4 families, based on the number of wickiups. The traditional dome-shaped dwellings made of wooden poles and covered with brush and hide. Now those structures were burning, sending columns of black smoke into the clear blue sky. Bodies lay scattered across the camp, twisted in death. Thomas counted quickly: 2 older men, 3 women, 1 clearly elderly and what looked like a teenage boy. All had been shot multiple times. The cavalry unit responsible for the attack was already preparing to leave. About 30 soldiers on horseback milled around the canyon entrance, while their lieutenant consulted a map with his sergeant. Thomas could hear fragments of their conversation carried on the wind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hostile camp neutralized, sir. No casualties on our side? Any prisoners? No, sir. They resisted when we called for surrender. We had no choice but to engage. Thomas's jaw clenched. He'd been around enough military men to recognize the lie in that exchange. This hadn't been combat. This had been a massacre. The Apache dead wore no war paint, carried no visible weapons. The camp showed all the signs of a peaceful settlement: drying racks for meat, grinding stones for preparing food. Children's toys scattered near one of the wickiups. The lieutenant gave an order Thomas couldn't quite hear, and the cavalry began moving out in formation, heading northeast toward what Thomas assumed was their post. The soldiers never looked back at what they'd done. Within minutes, they disappeared over the ridge, leaving only dust and death behind. Thomas waited another 10 minutes to be certain they were truly gone, then made his way down into the canyon. The descent was steep, requiring him to use both hands in places, but he managed it without dislodging rocks that might signal his presence to anyone still watching. Up close, the scene was even worse. The elderly woman had been shot while trying to shield what looked like a food preparation area. One of the younger women clutched a broken water jug, its contents spilled and already soaking into the dry earth. The men had fallen near the camp's perimeter, suggesting they'd tried to position themselves between the soldiers and their families. Thomas moved through the camp mechanically, his mind retreating from the horror by focusing on practical details. The fires were still burning, but would eventually die out on their own. The structures were small, and there wasn't much fuel. Some of the soldiers had ransacked the wickiups, probably looking for valuables or weapons. Blankets and baskets lay strewn about. A beautiful pottery vessel lay shattered near the central fire pit. He was about to leave, to get away from this place and try to process what he'd witnessed, when he heard it. A soft sound, almost like the mewing of a kitten. He froze, listening. There it was again, coming from behind an overturned wooden travois near the canyon wall. Thomas approached slowly, his heart hammering. Behind the travois, partially hidden by a deerskin that had fallen across her, was a child. A girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, pressed into a small crevice in the rock wall. Her eyes were huge and dark, fixed on him with pure terror. Blood streaked down her left arm from a wound at her shoulder, and her right leg was twisted at an angle that suggested injury. She tried to push herself further into the crevice, a small whimper escaping, despite her obvious attempt to stay silent. Her hands were scraped raw, probably from climbing into this hiding spot while the shooting was happening. She was breathing in quick, shallow gasps, on the edge of panic. Thomas stopped moving, staying about 6 feet away. He very slowly raised both hands, palms forward, in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. The girl's eyes darted from his face to his hands, to the rifle slung across his back, trying to calculate whether she could somehow escape. "Easy," Thomas said softly, keeping his voice as gentle as he could. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't understand the words, of course, but perhaps she understood the tone, or perhaps she was simply too injured and exhausted to run. Her breathing remained rapid, but she stopped trying to push further into the crevice. Thomas slowly unslung his canteen, moving with exaggerated care to avoid startling her. He uncapped it, took a small sip himself to show it was safe, then held it out toward her. "Water," he said, gesturing from the canteen to his mouth, the girl's eyes fixed on the canteen. Her lips were cracked and dry. She'd probably been hiding in this spot for hours, too terrified to move, even to seek water. But accepting water from him meant accepting his presence, meant trusting him. And trust was clearly something this child had no reason to give any white man. Thomas set the canteen down on the ground between them, then backed up several steps. "It's yours," he said. "I'm just going to wait over here." He turned partially away, trying to appear non-threatening, while still keeping her in his peripheral vision. For long seconds, nothing happened. Then, moving with the quickness of a wild animal, the girl darted forward, grabbed the canteen, and retreated to her crevice. She drank desperately, water spilling down her chin as she gulped. When the canteen was half empty, she stopped, lowering it but keeping it clutched in both hands. She watched Thomas with marginally less terror now, though suspicion remained etched in every line of her small body. Thomas took advantage of this slight thaw to assess her injuries more carefully. The shoulder wound appeared to be from a bullet graze, painful and bleeding, but not life-threatening if it was cleaned and bandaged. The leg concerned him more. She kept it extended stiffly, not bending it, which suggested either a fracture or a severe sprain. Even if he could convince her to let him help with the injuries, the larger problem loomed. What to do with her? He couldn't leave her here, alone, wounded, with no food or shelter beyond what remained in this destroyed camp. She'd die within days. Predators would find her, or exposure would take her, or she'd die of infection from untreated wounds. But taking her with him meant entering a complex web of danger. If the cavalry discovered he'd taken an Apache child from a site they'd attacked, he could be accused of harboring hostiles or interfering with military operations. If Apache warriors came looking for survivors and found their child with a white rancher, they'd have every reason to assume the worst. And if the townspeople in Granite Creek learned he'd brought an Apache girl to his ranch, the social consequences would be severe. As Thomas weighed these options, a sound from above the canyon made his decision for him. Voices speaking in Apache, coming from the rim. He recognized the cautious tone. Warriors approaching a dangerous situation, alert for threats. The girl heard them too. Her head snapped up, and for a moment hope flashed across her face. She opened her mouth, probably to call out, but Thomas moved quickly. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides and gently placed his hand over her mouth. "Don't," he whispered urgently. "Listen to me. Those men up there, if they see me with you like this, they'll think I'm part of what happened here. They'll kill me, and then what good will I be to you?" She struggled briefly but weakly. The blood loss and shock were taking their toll. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and Thomas felt her body go limp. She'd fainted. The voices above grew closer. Thomas could hear at least 3 distinct speakers, maybe more. They'd be in the canyon within minutes. He had seconds to make a choice. He lifted the girl as gently as he could, cradling her against his chest. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and her breathing was shallow but steady. Moving as quietly as possible, he carried her to the canyon's eastern wall, where a narrow cleft, barely wide enough for a man to pass through, led to a series of smaller side canyons. He'd explored this area years ago, while tracking a lost calf. The passage was tight, and Thomas had to turn sideways in places, careful not to bump the girl's injured leg against the rock walls. Behind him he heard the warriors enter the main canyon. Their voices changed, becoming anguished as they discovered the bodies. One man's cry of grief echoed off the stone walls, raw and primal. Thomas kept moving, driven by the knowledge that grief would quickly transform into rage. And any white man found near this massacre would be a target for that rage. He couldn't blame them. In their position, he'd feel the same way. The side canyon twisted and turned, creating a natural maze. Thomas followed it until he reached a spot where it opened into a small hidden valley, barely an acre across, surrounded by steep walls. A scraggly cottonwood tree marked where water occasionally pooled during heavy rains. The ground was softer here, sandy rather than rocky. He laid the girl down in the shade of the cottonwood, then stood listening. The voices from the main canyon were distant now, muffled by the intervening rock. He couldn't make out words, but the tone told him everything he needed to know. They were mourning their dead, and probably planning revenge. The girl stirred, her eyelids fluttering. Thomas knelt beside her, pulling his bandana from his pocket. He had limited medical supplies, but he could at least clean her wounds and fashion temporary bandages until he got her back to the ranch. "This is going to hurt," he told her, knowing she couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. "I'm sorry." He used water from his canteen to wet the bandana, then carefully cleaned the bullet graze on her shoulder. She woke fully when he touched the wound, her eyes snapping open and a sharp intake of breath escaping, despite her obvious attempt to stay quiet. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she didn't cry out. The stoicism impressed him. This child had been raised tough, trained not to show weakness even in pain. The wound was ugly but clean. The bullet had cut a shallow furrow across the top of her shoulder without striking bone. Thomas tore a strip from his shirt tail and bound it as tightly as he dared, creating pressure to stop the bleeding. She watched his every move with hawk-like intensity, ready to fight if she decided he was a threat. The leg was trickier. Thomas ran his hands carefully along the shin and ankle, probing gently for breaks. She winced several times but didn't pull away. His assessment: badly sprained ankle, possibly a hairline fracture, but nothing obviously broken. He used his belt to create a rough splint, immobilizing the ankle as best he could. "We need to move," he told her, knowing his tone would have to convey the urgency, even if his words didn't. "We can't stay here." The problem was getting her back to his horse without being seen. The warriors in the main canyon would be there for a while, conducting whatever rituals their culture prescribed for honoring the dead. But eventually they'd leave, and they might search the surrounding area looking for tracks or signs of who was responsible. Thomas made a decision. They'd wait until dusk. The warriors wouldn't likely stay after dark. Apache tradition held strong beliefs about spirits and the danger of being near the recently dead at night. Once they left, he could move the girl out under cover of darkness. The wait was agonizing. The girl drifted in and out of consciousness, fever already building from her injuries. Thomas rationed the remaining water between them, trying to keep her hydrated. He fashioned a crude sling from his shirt to carry her more easily when the time came to move. As the sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red, the voices from the main canyon finally faded. Thomas waited another 30 minutes to be sure, then carefully lifted the girl in the makeshift sling. She was awake now, her eyes glassy with fever, but alert enough to understand they were leaving. The journey back to where he'd left Copper was a nightmare. The girl's weight, slight as it was, became heavier with each step. The rough terrain required him to use his hands in places, which meant adjusting how he carried her constantly. Several times he had to stop and rest, his back and arms screaming with fatigue. Full darkness had fallen by the time they reached the juniper tree where Copper waited. The horse snorted nervously at the unfamiliar scent of the girl, but didn't bolt, well trained enough to trust Thomas's judgment. Getting mounted while holding an injured child required awkward maneuvering, but Thomas managed it, settling the girl in front of him, where he could hold her steady with one arm while controlling the reins with the other. The ride back to the ranch took twice as long as usual. Thomas kept Copper at a walk, unable to risk a faster pace with the girl's injuries and the darkness making every step treacherous. The girl alternated between periods of awareness and unconsciousness, occasionally whimpering when the horse's movement jarred her injured leg. By the time the lights of his cabin came into view, Thomas was exhausted and having serious second thoughts about the choice he'd made. He'd effectively kidnapped an Apache child from a massacre site. If the wrong people found out, he could hang. If the girl died despite his efforts, he'd have taken her from any chance of being found by her own people. And if she survived, what then? He couldn't keep her hidden forever. But as he dismounted and carried her toward the cabin, feeling her small body burning with fever against his chest, those doubts faded. Whatever complications lay ahead, they'd face them when they came. Right now, this child needed help, and he was the only one who could provide it. He kicked open the cabin door and carried her inside, laying her on the narrow bed in his small guest room. She was fully unconscious now, her breathing rapid and shallow. Thomas lit every lamp in the cabin, needing the light to properly tend her wounds. The next hours blurred together in a cycle of boiling water, cleaning wounds and trying to get liquids into her when she roused enough to swallow. Thomas had basic medical knowledge. Every rancher did, living this far from doctors, but this pushed the limits of his skill. He changed the bandages, applied a poultice made from herbs he kept for treating livestock, and wrapped her leg more securely. Around midnight, her fever broke. She woke fully, looked around the unfamiliar room, and for the first time since he'd found her, seemed to truly see him. Her eyes met his, and he saw intelligence there along with the fear. She was assessing him, trying to understand what kind of man had taken her from her destroyed home. Thomas pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said slowly. Then he pointed to her with a questioning look. She stared at him for a long moment. Then in a voice hoarse from crying and dehydration, she spoke a single word, "Nashota." It was the beginning. Dawn broke over the ranch with a pale light that seemed hesitant, as if uncertain about illuminating what the new day would bring. Thomas had barely slept, spending most of the night in a chair beside Nashota's bed, watching for any sign that her condition was worsening. Every hour he'd checked her fever, changed the dressing on her shoulder, and adjusted the splint on her leg. She slept fitfully, occasionally crying out in what he assumed was her native language. Once she screamed, a sound so full of terror that it brought Thomas to his feet instantly. But she hadn't woken, trapped instead in some nightmare replay of the previous day's horrors. He'd placed a hand gently on her forehead, speaking quietly until the dream released its grip and her breathing settled back into the rhythm of sleep. Now, with morning light filtering through the cabin's single window, Thomas assessed his situation with a clearer head. He had an Apache child in his home, wounded and orphaned. The cavalry unit responsible for the massacre would file reports claiming they'd eliminated a hostile camp. If any survivors were mentioned at all, they'd be listed as having escaped. No one would be looking for a child at his ranch, which provided some measure of safety. The greater danger came from two other directions. First, the Apache warriors who'd arrived at the canyon yesterday would be searching for survivors. They'd track anyone who'd been in that area, and Thomas's boots had left clear prints in several places. Second, if word reached Granite Creek that he'd taken in an Apache child, the community's reaction would be swift and harsh. Thomas stood and stretched, his back protesting from the hours in the chair. He needed to think practically. The girl required ongoing medical care, food appropriate for her condition, and eventually clothes. Her current garments were torn and blood-stained. She'd also need to understand that she was safe here, which would be difficult when he couldn't speak her language, and she had every reason to distrust white men. He walked to the kitchen area of the cabin and started a fire in the stove. Coffee first. His mind refused to function properly without it. While the water heated, he assessed his food supplies. He had flour, cornmeal, dried beans, some preserved vegetables, salt pork, and a few precious eggs from the chickens he kept behind the cabin. Nothing particularly suited for an injured child, but he'd make do. Thomas decided on a simple broth, easy to digest and nourishing. He put a pot of water on to boil, adding some of the dried vegetables and a small piece of salt pork for flavor. While it simmered, he checked on Nashota again. She was awake, her dark eyes following his movements with wary attention. "Good morning," he said softly, knowing she wouldn't understand, but hoping his tone conveyed friendliness. He pointed to the kitchen area, then mimicked eating. "Food, you need to eat," she didn't respond, but her eyes remained locked on him. Thomas noticed she'd positioned herself as far back on the bed as possible, her good leg drawn up defensively. Despite her injuries and obvious weakness, she was ready to fight if he threatened her. He held up one finger in a wait gesture and returned to the kitchen. When the broth had simmered long enough to be flavorful, he poured some into a wooden bowl and carried it back to the guest room. He set it on the small table beside the bed, well within her reach, but not so close as to crowd her. "Slowly," he said, making a gentle stirring motion with his hand. "Your stomach needs time." Nashota stared at the bowl, then at him, clearly torn between hunger and suspicion. Thomas solved the dilemma by taking a small sip from the bowl himself, showing it was safe. He set it back down and retreated to the doorway, giving her space. After a moment's hesitation, she reached for the bowl. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted it to her lips. She took a small sip, paused, then another. Thomas could see her forcing herself to drink slowly, despite what must be ravenous hunger. While she ate, Thomas considered his next steps. The ranch work couldn't wait. Cattle needed checking, horses required feeding, and water troughs needed filling. But he couldn't leave Nashota alone for long, not in her current state. He compromised by deciding to do only the most essential chores within sight of the cabin. When Nashota had finished half the broth, her eyelids began to droop. The food and the lingering effects of shock and blood loss were pulling her back towards sleep. Thomas took the bowl from her hands before she could drop it and helped her lie back down. She resisted initially, then seemed to realize she had no strength left to fight. Within minutes, she was asleep again. Thomas spent the morning in a state of controlled urgency. He fed and watered the horses, his eyes constantly returning to the cabin to ensure no smoke or other sign suggested trouble. He scattered grain for the chickens and collected eggs, a task that normally took 15 minutes but now stretched to 30 as he frequently stopped to listen for any sound from inside. Around midday, a distant dust cloud on the horizon froze him in place. Riders, at least 3 of them, coming from the direction of the canyon. Thomas's hand instinctively moved to the rifle he'd leaned against the barn wall. Were these the Apache warriors tracking him, or cavalry returning to search the area more thoroughly? He stood motionless, watching. The riders maintained their course for several minutes, then veered north, disappearing behind a rise. Not coming to his ranch then, just passing through the general area. Thomas released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The reprieve wouldn't last forever, but for now they remained undiscovered. That afternoon brought a new challenge. Nashota's fever spiked again, higher than before. She thrashed in the bed, calling out names Thomas didn't recognize. He spent hours applying cool cloths to her forehead, getting small amounts of water into her when she was lucid enough to swallow, and changing sweat-soaked bedding. At one point, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her eyes open but unseeing. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her tone urgent. Thomas had no idea what she was saying, but the desperation in her voice suggested she was reliving the massacre. Perhaps trying to warn her family, perhaps begging the soldiers to stop. "You're safe," he said firmly, though he knew she couldn't understand. "You're safe now. I've got you." Something in his tone must have penetrated the fever's grip. She focused on his face, really seeing him for perhaps the first time. Her grip on his wrist loosened slightly, though she didn't release him entirely. For a long moment they stayed frozen in that tableau, the white rancher and the Apache child, connected by circumstances neither had chosen, both trying to navigate toward uncertain safety. The fever finally broke near sunset. Nashota woke, clear-headed but weak, her body having spent its reserves fighting the infection. Thomas helped her sit up carefully, propping pillows behind her back. He brought her more broth, this time with some soft bread soaked in it to provide additional substance. She ate slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. When she'd finished, she set the bowl aside and spoke a single word. Why? Thomas was surprised she knew any English at all. "Why did I help you?" he asked. She nodded, waiting. How could he explain it in a way she'd understand? He thought for a moment, then spoke carefully, using simple words. "Because you needed help. Because what happened to your people was wrong. Because leaving you there would have been the same as killing you myself." She absorbed this, her expression unreadable. Then she asked another question. "You... soldier?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "Not soldier, rancher, I raise cattle. I don't fight. Men who came..." "Soldiers," she said, the words clearly difficult for her. "Yes," Thomas admitted. "Soldiers did that, bad men. I'm not with them." She studied him for a long time, as if trying to determine whether he was telling the truth. Finally, she gave a small nod. Not quite acceptance, but perhaps a willingness to believe him for now. Over the next few days, a fragile routine developed. Nashota's physical condition slowly improved. The shoulder wound began to heal cleanly, and while her ankle remained badly swollen, the splint Thomas had fashioned seemed to be working. She could stand with support and take a few hobbling steps, though the pain was evident in her face each time she tried. Communication remained challenging, but gradually improved. Nashota spoke more English than Thomas had initially realized. Basic words and simple phrases she'd apparently picked up from traders or from Apache who'd spent time near settlements. Thomas supplemented this by learning a few Apache words himself, mostly through pointing and repetition. He learned that she was 8 years old, that the people killed in the canyon had included her parents, her grandmother, an uncle, and 2 cousins. Her twin brother, the source of her name, which meant twin, had died 2 years earlier from fever. She spoke about this matter-of-factly, without visible emotion, but Thomas noticed she touched a small leather pouch that hung around her neck whenever she mentioned her brother. Whatever the pouch contained, it was clearly precious to her. Thomas told her about his ranch, about his life before coming to Arizona, about his own family back in Missouri. He kept his language simple and spoke slowly, aware that she understood only part of what he said. But the act of talking seemed important, a way of establishing that she was a person to him, not just a problem to be solved. On the 4th day after the massacre, Thomas made a decision that had been forming in his mind. He couldn't keep Nashota hidden forever, but he also couldn't simply turn her over to the authorities. The reservation system was notorious for its mistreatment of children, and military custody would likely be even worse. His only option was to claim responsibility for her openly and deal with whatever consequences arose. "Nashota," he said that evening as she sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, "I need to go to town tomorrow. For supplies. Do you understand?" She nodded warily. "I'm going to tell people you're here, that I'm taking care of you." Her eyes widened with alarm. "They will take me," she said, stumbling over the English. "Send me away." "I won't let them," Thomas promised, though he had no idea if he could actually prevent it. "But we can't hide you forever. Better to be honest now than to be caught in a lie later." She shook her head vehemently. "No town, dangerous. You'll stay here," Thomas assured her. "Hidden, safe. I'll go alone. But I have to start preparing people, start explaining. Otherwise, when they eventually find out, it will be much worse." Nashota looked at the fire, her jaw set in a stubborn line that reminded Thomas of himself. She didn't like this plan, but she also seemed to recognize she had little choice. After a long silence, she asked, "You come back?" The question struck Thomas harder than he expected. She was asking if he would abandon her, if his trip to town was just an excuse to hand her over to authorities or simply disappear from her life. "I'll come back," he said firmly. "I promise. You're under my protection now, Nashota. That means something." "I don't break my promises." She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once and returned her attention to the fire. The next morning, Thomas prepared for town with more care than usual. He needed to control the narrative about Nashota before rumors started. which meant being direct but strategic in how he presented the situation. He'd tell the truth, mostly, but frame it in a way that made his actions seem not just reasonable, but necessary. Before leaving, he spent time with Nashota, showing her where he kept the rifle, where the food was stored, and how to bar the door from inside. "Anyone comes," he told her seriously, "you hide. Under the bed, in the root cellar, anywhere they won't easily see you. Don't come out until you hear me call your name 3 times. Understand?" She nodded, her face pale but determined. 3 times, Thomas repeated. "Nashota, Nashota, Nashota," like that. "If you only hear it once or twice, stay hidden. It might be someone trying to trick you." "I understand," she said quietly. Thomas saddled Copper and rode out, glancing back several times at the cabin. Each time he looked, he could see Nashota's face in the window, watching him go. The sight of that small figure, alone and vulnerable despite her fierce spirit, made him more determined than ever to find a way through the complicated situation they'd found themselves in. The ride to Granite Creek took 3 hours. Thomas used the time to rehearse what he'd say, how he'd answer the inevitable questions. He knew the town well enough to predict the reactions, outrage from some, suspicion from others, and perhaps, if he was lucky, understanding from a few. The main street was moderately busy when he arrived, a dozen horses tied at various hitching posts. Thomas dismounted in front of the general store, which also served as the informal community gathering place. If he was going to spread word quickly, this was the place to start. Inside, the proprietor Jacob Morrison was helping a woman select fabric from the bolts stacked behind the counter. 2 men stood near the window discussing cattle prices. They all looked up when Thomas entered, offering nods of greeting. "Bennett," Morrison called out. "Haven't seen you in a couple weeks. Running low on supplies." "That and I need to have a conversation with folks," Thomas said evenly. "Something's happened that people should hear about from me directly." The tone of his voice caught their attention. The 2 men by the window turned fully toward him, and the woman purchasing fabric paused mid-sentence. Morrison set down the fabric he'd been holding. "What kind of something?" Morrison asked, his expression shifting toward concern. Thomas took a breath. This was it, the moment that would define how the next weeks or months would unfold. 4 days ago, I was checking water sources on my northern property when I came across the aftermath of a cavalry attack. Apache camp in the canyon. Everyone dead except for 1 child, a girl, badly wounded. I brought her back to my ranch, and I've been treating her injuries. The silence that followed his words was absolute. The woman gasped softly. The 2 men exchanged glances that Thomas couldn't quite read. Morrison's face went through several expressions: surprise, concern, and finally, something that might have been worry. "An Apache child," Morrison said slowly. "At your ranch, now?" "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "She's 8 years old, injured and orphaned. I couldn't leave her to die." One of the men by the window, a rancher named Pete Hollis, spoke up. "That massacre in Black Canyon. We heard about that. Army said it was a hostile camp, said they were planning raids." "There's no way that camp was hostile," Thomas said flatly. "Old people, women, children. No weapons I could see. No war paint. They were murdered, Pete, and that little girl saw the whole thing." "Still," the other man interjected, "keeping an Apache at your place, that's asking for trouble. What if her people come looking? What if the army finds out you took someone from a site they cleared?" "Then I'll deal with it," Thomas said. "But I'm not throwing an 8-year-old child to the wolves, literally or figuratively, just because it's convenient." The woman, whom Thomas now recognized as Sarah Pritchard, the schoolteacher, surprised him by speaking up. "What are your plans for her, Mr. Bennett?" "Long term, I mean. She can't hide at your ranch forever." It was a fair question, and one Thomas didn't have a complete answer to. "Right now, I'm focused on keeping her alive and healing her injuries. Beyond that, I suppose I'll raise her if no acceptable alternative presents itself." "Raise her?" Hollis said incredulously. "A bachelor rancher raising an Apache girl? Bennett, think about what you're saying. The complications alone are my burden to bear," Thomas interrupted. I'm not asking anyone else to take responsibility. I'm simply informing the community so there are no surprises if someone happens to see her or if questions come up. Morrison drummed his fingers on the counter, thinking, the preacher's going to have strong opinions about this. Reverend Caldwell, he's got particular views about savages and civilization. Reverend Caldwell is welcome to his opinions, Thomas said calmly. But the decision is mine, not his. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with various townspeople entering the store and getting drawn into the discussion. Reactions ranged from cautious support to outright hostility. Thomas held his ground, answering questions honestly, but refusing to budge on his fundamental position. Nashota was under his protection, and that wasn't going to change. By the time he'd purchased his supplies and prepared to head back, word had spread through most of the town. Small clusters of people stood in doorways and on boardwalks, talking in urgent tones. Thomas could feel their eyes on him as he loaded his purchases onto copper, their judgment a tangible weight. As he was mounting up, Reverend Caldwell appeared, his face stern. Mr. Bennett, a word. Thomas settled into the saddle but didn't ride off. Reverend, what you're doing is dangerous, Caldwell said without preamble. Dangerous spiritually, dangerous practically. That child is a heathen, raised in savage ways. Bringing her into your home, a single man's home, is improper and potentially corrupting. That child is an orphan who watched her family be murdered, Thomas replied, his voice hard. If Christianity means leaving her to die rather than risk impropriety, then I'm not sure what kind of Christianity you're preaching. Caldwell's face reddened. Don't twist my words. I'm not suggesting she be left to die. There are proper channels, the reservation schools, the missionary societies, places equipped to civilize and Christianize her. Places that would strip away everything she is and try to make her into a poor copy of something she's not. Thomas countered. No thank you, Reverend. She stays with me. He touched his hat brim in a gesture that was more dismissal than courtesy and urged Copper forward. Behind him, he could hear Caldwell calling out something about consequences and judgment, but Thomas didn't look back. The ride home seemed longer than the journey out. Thomas felt the weight of what he'd set in motion. The town knew now, and that meant complications were coming. But at least they'd heard it from him first, framed in his words, rather than discovered through rumor and speculation. When the cabin came into view, relief flooded through him. It looked undisturbed, no signs of visitors. He called out as he approached, "Nashota! Nashota! Nashota!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door cracked open slightly, and he saw her peering out. When she confirmed it was really him, she opened the door wider, and the relief on her face mirrored his own. "You came back," she said as he dismounted. "I told you I would," Thomas replied. He began unloading supplies, and to his surprise, Nashota hobbled out to help despite her injured leg. "You should rest that ankle," he cautioned. "I am strong," she said stubbornly, carrying a small sack inside with determination, watching her navigate the cabin steps with fierce independence despite obvious pain. Thomas smiled despite the day's tensions. Yes, she was strong. She'd need to be for what lay ahead. They both would. 3 weeks after Thomas's announcement in town, life at the ranch had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Nashota's wounds were healing well. The shoulder injury had closed cleanly, leaving only a pale scar that would fade with time, and her ankle had regained most of its strength. She moved around the cabin with increasing confidence, helping with small tasks, despite Thomas's insistence that she should rest. She'd begun learning English at a remarkable pace, absorbing new words daily. Thomas discovered she had a sharp mind and an almost desperate desire to understand this new world she'd been forced into. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, they'd sit by the fire and he'd teach her, pointing to objects and saying their names, acting out verbs, drawing simple pictures in the dirt outside to illustrate concepts. But underneath the surface calm, Thomas could sense her restlessness. She never smiled. She rarely spoke unless spoken to. And sometimes he'd catch her staring out the window toward the northern hills, her expression distant and haunted. She was alive and safe, but she wasn't healing in the ways that mattered most. The situation couldn't last. Thomas knew it, even if he didn't want to admit it. Nashota belonged with her people, not isolated on a ranch with a white man who couldn't give her the connection to her culture and identity that she needed. But finding those people safely, in a way that wouldn't endanger her or him, was proving impossible. The decision was taken out of his hands on a cool morning in late July. Thomas was in the barn, mucking out stalls, when Copper gave a warning whinny. He straightened, pitchfork in hand, and moved to the barn door. 4 Apache men sat on horseback at the edge of his property, perfectly still, watching the cabin. They were armed, rifles across their laps, knives at their belts, but they made no threatening moves. Thomas's heart hammered as he recognized this for what it was. They'd come for Nashota. He set down the pitchfork and walked slowly toward them, hands visible and empty. As he drew closer, he could see these were seasoned warriors, their faces marked with the lines of men who'd lived hard lives. The one in the center, slightly ahead of the others, had gray threading through his black hair and eyes that missed nothing. Thomas stopped about 20 feet away. "I'm Thomas Bennett," he said clearly. "This is my land." The gray-haired man nodded slowly. "I am Cocheta," he replied in surprisingly good English. "Uncle to the child you have taken." "I didn't take her," Thomas said carefully. "I found her wounded after soldiers attacked your camp. I've been caring for her injuries." Cocheta's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Grief, perhaps, or anger held tightly in check. "We have searched many days. We found your tracks at the canyon. We have watched your ranch. We have seen the child in the window." So they'd been observing him, probably for days. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine at how vulnerable he'd been without knowing it. "She was badly hurt," he said. "She needed medical care. And now?" Cocheta asked. "Now she's healing. Her shoulder wound has closed. Her ankle is mostly recovered." One of the younger warriors spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone aggressive. Cocheta held up a hand, silencing him, but kept his eyes on Thomas. "My nephew believes you have kept her as a captive, perhaps to ransom. Perhaps for worse reasons." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Your nephew is wrong. She's free to leave whenever she wishes. But she's just a child who watched her entire family die. Where would she go? How would she survive alone?" "She would come to us," Cocheta said simply. "To her people, where she belongs." Before Thomas could respond, the cabin door opened. Nashota stood in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame for support. She looked at the 4 warriors, and something complicated passed across her face. Recognition, relief, but also uncertainty. Cocheta dismounted in one fluid motion and walked toward her. He spoke in Apache, his voice gentle. Nashota replied, also in Apache, and Thomas caught his own name in the flow of words. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Cocheta occasionally glancing back at Thomas. Finally, Cocheta turned to face him fully. "The child says you have treated her well, that you saved her life and have asked nothing in return. She says you are not like the other white men." "I'd like to think that's true," Thomas said quietly. "But she also says she is lonely here, that she dreams of her mother and wakes crying, that she doesn't know where she belongs anymore." Cocheta's voice carried both sympathy and determination. "She is Apache. She needs to be with Apache people, to learn Apache ways, to heal among those who understand her loss." Thomas looked at Nashota, who stood very still in the doorway. Their eyes met, and he saw the truth there. She was grateful to him, maybe even cared for him in her own way, but Cocheta was right. She needed more than he could give her. "If I let her go with you," Thomas said slowly, "how do I know she'll be safe? The army is hunting any Apache they find off the reservations." "We live in the mountains," Cocheta replied. "Places the soldiers cannot easily reach. We move with the seasons. We take care of our own." "And if she wants to come back?" "To visit?" Cocheta studied him for a long moment. "You care for the child?" "I do," Thomas admitted. "I know she's not mine, that I have no claim on her. But yes, I care what happens to her. This is good, Cochetta said, and for the first time his stern expression softened slightly. It is rare to find a white man with an open heart. But the child needs her people now. She needs to grieve in the proper way, to be taught by the women, to grow up knowing who she is. Thomas nodded slowly, the weight of the inevitable settling on him. "Nashota," he called out. "Come here, please." She walked to them, favoring her injured leg only slightly now. Thomas knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Your uncle has come for you. He wants to take you to live with your people. Is that what you want?" She looked between Thomas and Cochetta, her young face struggling with the decision. "You not want me to stay? I want you to be happy," Thomas said gently. "I want you to be with people who can teach you things I can't, who can help you remember your family properly, who can give you a future I don't know how to provide. But that doesn't mean I want you to go. Do you understand the difference?" She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I want both. Stay here. Go with Uncle. But must choose." "Yes," Thomas said. "You must choose, and I'll support whatever you decide." Nashota turned to Cochetta and spoke in Apache. He replied, his tone warm and reassuring. She asked another question, longer this time. He answered, gesturing toward the mountains. They went back and forth several times, and Thomas waited patiently, excluded from the conversation but content to let her work through the decision in her own language. Finally, she turned back to Thomas. "I go," she said, her voice small, "but I come back. When I'm older, I promise." Thomas felt something twist in his chest, but he kept his expression steady. "I'll be here," he said. "Whenever you're ready." She threw her arms around his neck suddenly, hugging him with surprising strength. Thomas returned the embrace, feeling her small body shake with silent sobs. He held her until she pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You good man," she said, repeating the words she'd spoken weeks ago. "Best white man." Thomas managed a smile despite the ache in his throat. "You're a strong girl, Nashota. You're going to grow up to be remarkable. Don't forget that." She nodded solemnly, then walked to Cochetta, who helped her mount behind one of the younger warriors. Thomas went into the cabin and quickly gathered her few possessions. The torn dress she'd arrived in, now washed and mended, the small leather pouch she always wore, and a blanket he'd given her. He brought them out and handed them to Cochetta. "Take care of her," Thomas said. "As if she were my own daughter," Cochetta promised. He mounted his horse, then paused. "You have honor, Thomas Bennett. This is not forgotten. If you ever need help, if danger comes to you because of what you did for this child, send word. We pay our debts." The four riders turned and began moving toward the northern hills. Nashota looked back once, raising her hand in farewell. Thomas raised his in return, standing motionless until they disappeared from view. The ranch felt emptier than it had before Nashota arrived. Thomas threw himself into work, using physical exhaustion to keep the loneliness at bay. He expanded his herd, bought 2 more horses, and built an addition to the barn that he didn't really need. Neighbors commented that he seemed driven, working from before dawn until well after dark, as if trying to outrun something. The townspeople of Granite Creek eventually stopped talking about the Apache girl who'd briefly lived at the Bennett Ranch. Other scandals and concerns took precedence. Thomas attended church irregularly, bought his supplies without incident, and slowly became known as the quiet rancher who kept to himself and caused no trouble. Seasons turned. Autumn painted the cottonwoods gold. Winter brought snow that turned the landscape into a sea of white. Spring returned with its riot of wildflowers. Thomas marked time by the cycles of cattle breeding, foaling, and sales. His operation grew modestly successful. He hired hands occasionally for roundups, but never kept anyone on permanently. He preferred solitude, but he thought of Nashota often, wondering how she was adapting to life with her people, whether she was happy, whether she still remembered him. On quiet evenings, he'd find himself looking toward the northern mountains, half expecting to see a small figure walking toward the ranch. Years passed. 1 became 2, then 5, then 8. Thomas turned 38. His hair began showing gray at the temples. His hands grew more calloused, his face more weathered. He'd started building something that resembled a real ranch, a larger cabin, better fencing, a more reliable water system. The territory itself was changing. The Apache wars were winding down as more warriors surrendered or were captured. Reservations became more crowded and controlled. The railroad reached Prescott, bringing rapid growth and changing the character of the settlement. Granite Creek officially became part of Prescott, its rough edges smoothing into something approaching civilization. Thomas adapted to these changes without embracing them. He maintained cordial relationships with his neighbors, fulfilled his civic obligations, and stayed out of politics. People knew him as reliable, fair in his dealings, and good with horses. But they also knew he wasn't interested in socializing, in courting, in becoming more integrated into community life. Women occasionally expressed interest, widows needing security, young women seeking escape from their families. Thomas politely declined all such overtures. He told himself it was because ranch life was too demanding, too uncertain, too harsh for a woman unaccustomed to it. But the truth, which he barely admitted even to himself, was that he'd closed off that part of his heart the day Nashota rode away. In the 10th year after her departure, Thomas celebrated his 38th birthday alone with a bottle of decent whiskey he'd saved for no particular occasion. He sat on the porch of his expanded cabin, looking out over land that was undeniably his. 2,000 acres now, 500 head of cattle, a string of quality horses. By any measure, he was successful. By most measures, he was lonely. He was raising the glass in a solitary toast to another year when he saw the rider. At first, it was just a speck on the horizon, coming from the north. Thomas watched idly, assuming it was a neighbor or perhaps someone lost and looking for directions. As the figure drew closer, he could see it was a woman riding alone, which was unusual. Closer still, and something about the way she sat the horse. The straightness of her posture triggered a memory he couldn't quite place. She was within 100 yards when recognition hit him like a physical blow. Thomas stood slowly, the whiskey glass forgotten in his hand. It couldn't be. She'd been 8 years old, a child. This was a woman, tall and strong, her long black hair in a single braid down her back. But those eyes, dark and intelligent and unmistakable, were Nashota's eyes. She reined in her horse 20 feet from the porch, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other. She'd grown beautiful, Thomas realized with a jolt. Not in the delicate way of the women in town, but with a strength and vitality that took his breath away. She wore a mix of Apache and settler clothing, doeskin leggings under a simple cotton skirt, a woven shirt with traditional beadwork, and sturdy riding boots. "Nashota," Thomas said, his voice rough with disbelief. "I told you I would come back," she replied in perfect English, with only the slightest trace of an accent. "I always keep my promises." Thomas descended the porch steps slowly, hardly believing she was real. You're all grown up." "I'm 18, she said matter-of-factly. "A woman by any measure. And I've come back for a reason." She dismounted in one graceful movement, landing lightly on her feet. She walked toward him with confidence, closing the distance until she stood directly in front of him. Thomas noticed she was tall for a woman, her eyes nearly level with his own. "What reason?" Thomas asked, though his heart was already pounding with an answer he didn't dare voice. Nashota looked at him steadily, her expression both serious and tender. "I've thought of you every day for 10 years. I've refused 3 warriors who wanted to marry me. I've told my uncle and my people that my heart made its choice long ago." She paused, then spoke with absolute certainty. "Now I'm your woman." The words hung in the air between them, and Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Everything he'd built in the past decade, the walls he'd constructed around his heart, the safe isolation he'd cultivated, all of it crumbled in the face of her declaration. "Nashota," he began. But she raised her hand, stopping him. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't tell me I'm too young, or that this is impossible, or that I don't know what I want. I've spent 10 years growing, learning, preparing for this moment. I know exactly what I want, Thomas Bennett. The question is, do you? Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened child he'd rescued, but a woman who'd chosen her own path with eyes wide open. And for the first time in 10 years, he felt something other than loneliness take root in his chest. It felt like hope. Thomas stood frozen on his porch, the whiskey glass still clutched in his hand, staring at the woman before him as if she might vanish like a desert mirage. Nashota waited, her dark eyes locked on his, patient but expectant. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out. "You can't just—" Thomas started, then stopped, running his free hand through his hair. "Nashota, this isn't— You don't understand what you're saying." "I understand perfectly," she replied, her voice calm and measured. "I'm saying that I've chosen you, that I want to build a life here with you, as your wife." The word wife hit Thomas like cold water. He set the glass down on the porch railing with exaggerated care, buying himself time to think. "I'm 38 years old. You're 18. I'm old enough to be your father, but you're not my father," Nashota said simply. "You're the man who saved my life when he could have walked away, the man who treated me with kindness when the world showed me only cruelty. The man I've measured every other man against for 10 years. That's exactly my point," Thomas said, his voice strained. "You were a child when we met. What you're feeling might just be gratitude, or don't presume to tell me what I feel," Nashota interrupted, her tone sharpening. "I know the difference between gratitude and love. I've had 10 years to examine my heart, Thomas. 10 years among my people, where I was valued and cared for. 3 warriors sought to marry me. Good men, skilled hunters, respected in the tribe. I refused them all." She stepped closer, and Thomas found himself unable to retreat. "Do you know what I told them? I told them my heart belonged to a white rancher who showed me what honor looks like, who taught me that strength and gentleness aren't opposites, who gave me back my life and asked nothing in return." "Nashota," Thomas tried again, but she wasn't finished. "Among my people, a woman of 18 is not a child. I've been considered ready for marriage since I was 15. I've learned to tan hides, prepare food, make clothing, track game, and treat wounds. I've helped deliver babies and bury the dead. I've sat in council and had my voice heard on matters affecting our band. I'm not the frightened girl you rescued." Thomas could see that was true. The woman before him carried herself with confidence born of competence and hard-won wisdom. But that didn't resolve the fundamental problem. "Even if I believed everything you're saying, and I'm not saying I don't, you have to understand what this would mean. An Apache woman and a white rancher? The town can accept it or not as they choose," Nashota said flatly. "I didn't ride here seeking their approval. I came for yours." "It's not that simple," Thomas protested. "There are laws, social conventions, prejudices that run deep. People barely tolerated you living here as a child under my care. This would be something else entirely. Are you refusing me because you're afraid of what others will think?" Nashota asked, her eyes narrowing. That doesn't sound like the Thomas Bennett I remember. The challenge in her voice stung because it was accurate. Thomas prided himself on his independence, on making decisions based on what was right rather than what was convenient. But this was different, wasn't it? This wasn't just about him. "I'm trying to protect you," he said quietly. "From gossip, from prejudice, from people who would treat you badly because of who you are and who I am." "I don't need your protection," Nashota replied, though her tone softened slightly. "I need your honesty. Do you want me here, Thomas? Not as a child you once helped, but as a woman. Because if you don't, if there's no feeling beyond obligation or nostalgia, tell me now and I'll leave. I won't force myself on someone who doesn't want me." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and felt the careful walls he'd built around his heart beginning to crumble. Of course he wanted her here. He'd wanted it from the moment he recognized her riding toward the ranch. But wanting and having were 2 different things. "It's not about want," he said finally. "God help me, Nashota. I've been half in love with you since the day you rode away with your uncle. I spent 10 years telling myself it was just concern for a child I'd helped, that it would fade with time. It didn't. Something blazed in Nashota's eyes. Triumph, joy, vindication. Then what's the problem? The problem is I'm twice your age. The problem is that loving you feels wrong, like I'm taking advantage of something that started when you were vulnerable. The problem is that I don't trust myself to know if this is real or if I'm just a lonely man convincing himself he deserves something he doesn't. Nashota reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and warm. Let me tell you what my uncle said when I told him I was coming here. He said that true courage isn't fighting enemies you can see, it's facing the fears in your own heart. He said you showed courage when you saved me, but now you need courage of a different kind. She pulled him gently toward the porch steps, and they sat together, still holding hands. The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Thomas. I'm not asking you to have all the answers. I'm just asking you to be honest about what you feel and to trust that I know my own mind. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the play of light across the landscape he'd worked so hard to build. Finally he spoke. When you left, it felt like someone had carved out a piece of me. I told myself it was natural. I'd gotten used to having you around, to having someone to care for. But it was more than that. You made this place feel like a home instead of just a ranch. He turned to look at her, seeing the fading light reflected in her dark eyes. I'm scared, Nashota. Scared of making a mistake that hurts you. Scared of what people will say and do. Scared that I'll wake up one day and you'll realize you've wasted your life on an old rancher when you could have had so much more. Then be scared, Nashota said simply. Be scared with me beside you. I'm terrified too, of being rejected, of not being enough, of the white world that still sees my people as less than human. But I'd rather face those fears with you than hide from them alone. She squeezed his hand. I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm not asking you to suddenly overcome years of doubt and social conditioning. I'm just asking you to let me stay, to give this a chance. If after time you truly believe it can't work, I'll accept that. But don't refuse me out of fear alone. Thomas felt something shift inside him, like a locked door finally opening. Where have you been staying? With your uncle's band. They're camped about 20 miles north in the high country, Nashota confirmed. But I told them I might not return, that this was my choice to make, and if I'd refused you completely, she smiled slightly, then I would have asked to stay anyway, as your hired hand. You need help with the ranch. I can see the work that's piling up, the things one man can't manage alone. I'm strong. I know horses and cattle, and I work harder than most men you could hire. Despite everything, Thomas found himself smiling back. You had a backup plan. I always have a backup plan, Nashota said. My uncle taught me that. Never put yourself in a position where you only have one option. Smart man, your uncle. He likes you, Nashota said. He said any man who could return a child to her people without seeking reward or recognition is someone worth knowing. He gave me his blessing to come here, though he worries about how the whites will treat me. He's right to worry, Thomas said honestly. It won't be easy. Nothing worth having is easy, Nashota replied. My mother used to say that. She'd probably be horrified by my choice. She didn't trust white men at all after what they did to our people. But she also taught me to follow my heart, to make my own path. So here I am. They sat in companionable silence as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky awash in purples and deep blues. Thomas found himself acutely aware of her hand in his, of the warmth of her presence beside him. It felt right in a way he couldn't fully articulate. You can stay in the guest room, he said finally. The one you had before. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. How to manage the work, what to tell people when they ask questions, all of it. But tonight let's just be glad you're here safely, Nashota nodded, accepting the compromise. Thank you, Thomas. Don't thank me yet, he said wryly. You might regret this decision once you see how much work needs doing around here. I doubt that, she said, standing and pulling him up with her. But I'll let you know if I do. They went inside together, and Thomas showed her to the guest room, now much nicer than the sparse space she'd occupied as a child. He'd added proper furniture over the years, including a real bed frame with a comfortable mattress, a wardrobe, and a small desk by the window. "It's beautiful," Nashota said, running her hand along the smooth wood of the wardrobe. "You've built something good here, Thomas." "Tried to," he said from the doorway. "There's water in the pitcher for washing, and I'll get some extra blankets from the chest." "It gets cold at night this time of year." "I remember," she said softly, turning to face him. "I remember everything about this place. It was the first time I felt safe after my world ended." The vulnerability in her voice, so different from her earlier boldness, made Thomas's chest tighten. He wanted to cross the room and hold her, to promise that she'd always be safe here. But instead he simply nodded. "Get some rest. Morning comes early on a ranch, Thomas," she called as he turned to leave. "Yes, I meant what I said. Every word. I know you need time to believe it, but I'll say it as many times as necessary until you do." Thomas met her gaze across the room. "I believe you meant it. I'm just not sure I deserve it. Let me be the judge of what you deserve," Nashota replied. "Good night, Thomas." "Good night, Nashota." He closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. What had just happened? Had he really agreed to let her stay? Was he really considering the possibility that this remarkable, impossible woman wanted to build a life with him? Thomas walked to his own room, the master bedroom he'd built years ago and never shared with anyone. He lay down on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Every objection he'd raised was valid. The age difference, the cultural gulf, the social prejudice they'd face, none of that had disappeared just because his heart wanted it to. But maybe Nashota was right. Maybe courage meant facing those fears rather than hiding from them. Maybe love, if that's what this was, required a leap of faith rather than a carefully calculated risk assessment. "I slept" was a long time. Morning arrived with the crow of his rooster, and Thomas rose from bed feeling like he'd barely slept at all. He dressed quickly and went to the kitchen to start coffee, moving through the familiar routine on autopilot. He'd just gotten the fire going in the stove when he heard footsteps behind him. Nashota stood in the doorway, already dressed in practical clothes, the same outfit from yesterday. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked more rested than he felt. "Good morning," she said. "Put me to work." Thomas couldn't help but smile at her directness. "You just got here. Take a day to settle in, look around." "I didn't come here to be a guest," Nashota interrupted. "I came to be useful. So tell me what needs doing." Thomas studied her determined expression and recognized when he was beaten. "All right. After breakfast, we'll start with the horses. I've got 3 that need shoeing, and the barn could use some organization." "If you're as good with horses as you claim." "I am," she said confidently. "Then we'll see," Thomas said. Though he was already pretty sure she wasn't exaggerating. They ate a simple breakfast of eggs, bread and coffee, falling into an easy conversation about the ranch operations. Nashota asked intelligent questions about his breeding program, his relationships with buyers, and his plans for expansion. Her knowledge of horses was immediately apparent. She used terms and concepts that showed real understanding, not just casual familiarity. After breakfast, they headed to the barn together. Thomas's 3 horses needing work were in the corral. A bay mare with a temperamental streak, a young gelding still being trained, and an older horse that had always been suspicious of strangers. "Start with whichever one you want," Thomas said, leaning against the corral fence to watch. Nashota entered the corral slowly, speaking softly in Apache. To Thomas's amazement, the temperamental mare walked directly to her, ears forward with curiosity rather than aggression. Nashota stroked her neck, continuing to speak in low tones, and the mare relaxed completely. "She's beautiful," Nashota called to Thomas. "What's her name?" "Storm," Thomas replied, "because she's unpredictable. She just needed someone to speak her language," Nashota said, running her hands expertly along the mare's legs, checking for soundness. "She's favoring the right front slightly. When was she last shod?" Thomas straightened, impressed. He'd noticed the slight favoring himself, but hadn't expected Nashota to pick it up so quickly. "About 3 months ago. The shoe's probably loose. Nashota nodded, already moving to examine the hoof. Definitely loose. I can reset it if you have the tools. You know how to shoe horses? Thomas asked, surprised. She looked up at him with amusement. My uncle believed everyone in the band should have multiple skills. I can shoe a horse, mend-tack, castrate a calf, and deliver a foal. I told you I wasn't useless. I never thought you were useless, Thomas said. I'm just impressed. Good, Nashota replied, her eyes sparkling. Because I planned to keep impressing you. They worked together throughout the morning, and Thomas found himself constantly surprised by her competence. She handled tools like someone who'd used them for years. She moved around the horses with confidence and skill. She even spotted a weak point in the corral fence that Thomas had missed, suggesting a repair method that was smarter than what he'd planned. By midday, they'd finished with all 3 horses and made significant progress organizing the barn. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead and looked at Nashota, who showed no signs of tiring despite the physical labor. You really meant it about pulling your weight, he said. Always, she replied. I don't make promises I can't keep. They were heading back to the cabin for lunch when Thomas spotted dust on the horizon. His stomach sank. Riders coming from the direction of town. At least 4 of them. We've got company, he said grimly. Nashota followed his gaze, her expression hardening. How do you want to handle this? Honestly, Thomas said, they'll find out eventually anyway. Might as well be from us. The riders turned out to be exactly who Thomas had feared, Reverend Caldwell, accompanied by 3 prominent men from town, Jacob Morrison from the general store, Pete Hollis, the rancher, and Sheriff Wade Garrett. They reined in their horses at a respectful distance from the cabin, but their faces were stern. Caldwell spoke first, his voice carrying clear disapproval. Bennett, we heard disturbing news. Someone claimed they saw an Indian woman at your ranch. We came to see if it was true. Thomas stepped forward, Nashota beside him. It's true. This is Nashota. Some of you might remember her from 10 years ago. Morrison's eyes widened with recognition. The child you rescued? But she's 18 now, Thomas said firmly. A grown woman. She's come back to help me run the ranch. Help you run the ranch, Caldwell repeated slowly, his tone making clear he didn't believe that was all. A young Apache woman living here alone with you, a bachelor. Surely you can see how inappropriate this appears. I can see how it might appear to small minds, Thomas replied, his voice hardening. But Nashota is here of her own free will, doing honest work, and that's all anyone needs to know. Sheriff Garrett spoke up, his tone more measured than Caldwell's. Thomas, you know I respect you, but you're putting yourself in a difficult position. There are people in town who won't see this kindly. For your own sake, I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, Thomas interrupted. But my decisions about my own ranch are mine to make. Nashota stays, the 4 men exchanged glances. Finally, Hollis cleared his throat. There's talk of the territorial governor making new regulations about whites and Indians living together. Could be trouble coming down from above, not just from neighbors. Let it come, Thomas said flatly. I'm not turning away someone who needs a place because of unjust laws or prejudiced neighbors. Nashota had remained silent throughout the exchange. But now she spoke, her English clear and her voice steady. I understand your concern for Mr. Bennett's reputation. I assure you, I'm here as an employee, nothing more. I work for my keep. If that's too shocking for your town's sensibilities, perhaps the problem lies with the town, not with us. The directness of her words seemed to catch them off guard. Caldwell sputtered slightly, but Morrison surprised Thomas by nodding slowly. The girl has a point, Morrison said. If she's working, earning her way, I don't see the legal problem. Might be unusual, but unusual isn't the same as wrong. It's more than unusual, Caldwell began, but Sheriff Garrett cut him off. It's Bennett's business, the sheriff said firmly. He looked at Thomas. You'll let me know if there's any trouble. You'll be the first to know, Thomas promised. The sheriff nodded and turned his horse. Morrison followed, though Hollis lingered a moment longer. Giving Thomas a look that might have been sympathy or warning, Thomas couldn't quite tell. Caldwell was the last to leave, his final words thrown over his shoulder. This isn't over, Bennett. Mark my words. As the four riders disappeared back toward town, Thomas let out a long breath. Nashota touched his arm lightly. That went better than expected, she said. That was just the first wave, Thomas replied. It'll get worse before it gets better. Then we'll face worse together, Nashota said simply. Like I told you, I didn't come here expecting it to be easy. Thomas looked at her, standing strong and unafraid beside him, despite the challenges they both knew were coming, and felt something settle into place inside him. Maybe this was impossible. Maybe it would end badly. But maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. Come on, he said. We've still got afternoon chores, and standing here worrying won't get them done. They walked back toward the barn together, and Thomas allowed himself a small smile. Whatever came next, at least he wouldn't face it alone. The weeks following the confrontation with the townspeople settled into a pattern that was both comfortable and charged with unspoken tension. Thomas and Nashota worked the ranch side by side, their coordination improving daily as they learned each other's rhythms and habits. She proved herself invaluable, not just capable, but genuinely skilled at tasks that would have challenged most hired hands. But beneath the surface of their working partnership, something else was growing. Thomas caught himself watching her when she worked with the horses, admiring the graceful efficiency of her movements. He noticed the way sunlight caught in her hair, the sound of her quiet singing in Apache when she thought he couldn't hear. And sometimes he'd look up to find her watching him with an expression that made his breath catch, patient, knowing, waiting for him to catch up to what she already understood. They maintained careful propriety. Nashota slept in the guest room with the door closed. They ate meals together, but kept conversation focused on practical matters, cattle counts, fence repairs, weather predictions. To any observer, they were exactly what Thomas had claimed, employer and employee. Nothing more, but in the quiet moments, a hand briefly touching during a shared task, eyes meeting across the corral, the comfortable silence of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. The truth was obvious. Whatever was between them had nothing to do with employment. The first real test came 3 weeks after Nashota's return. Thomas was replacing boards on the bridge that crossed the creek on his eastern boundary when he heard the sound of multiple horses approaching fast. He straightened, hammer in hand, and saw 5 riders coming hard from the direction of town. Something in their body language, aggressive, purposeful, sent alarm bells ringing. He recognized them immediately. Daniel Pritchard, the schoolteacher's brother and a known hothead. 2 of the Carver boys, ranch hands with reputations for drinking and fighting. And 2 men Thomas didn't know, but who had the look of drifters. The kind who hired on for seasonal work and caused trouble wherever they went. Thomas dropped the hammer and started walking quickly back toward the cabin. Nashota was there alone, working on mending tack in the shade of the porch. She looked up as the riders approached, her posture shifting subtly into alertness. The 5 men reined in hard, their horses stamping and snorting. Pritchard, clearly the leader, fixed his eyes on Nashota with undisguised contempt. "Well, well," he said, his words slightly slurred. "They'd been drinking. The rumors are true. Bennett's keeping himself a squaw." Nashota stood slowly, setting aside the leather she'd been working on. Her face was impassive, but Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders. "Mr. Bennett isn't here right now. You'll need to come back later." "Oh, I think we're exactly where we need to be," Pritchard said, dismounting along with the others. "See, we've got a problem. Your kind killed my cousin 2 years back. Apache raid up north. Got him down while he was just trying to make a living. I'm sorry for your loss," Nashota said carefully. "But I had nothing to do with that. All you savages are the same," one of the Carver boys spat. "You think you can come here, live among decent white folk, like you're one of us? You ain't. And Bennett's a fool or worse for letting you stay." Thomas was running now, closing the distance as fast as he could. He was still 200 yards away when Pritchard started up the porch steps toward Nashota. "Maybe we should teach you your place," Pritchard said menacingly. "Teach Bennett a lesson, too, about keeping vermin on his property." Nashota didn't back away. Instead, she moved with startling speed, her hand coming up with a knife, a small blade Thomas hadn't even known she carried. She held it competently, her stance that of someone who knew how to use it. "The first man who touches me dies," she said calmly. "Maybe I die too, but he dies first. Who wants to be first?" The casual certainty in her voice made Pritchard hesitate. The other men looked at each other uncertainly. They'd expected fear, submission, an easy target. This wasn't what they'd planned for. "You threatening us?" Pritchard demanded, trying to regain his bravado. "I'm making a promise," Nashota replied. "You came here looking for trouble. I'm explaining what that trouble will cost you." Thomas burst into the clearing, his rifle in his hands, breathing hard from the run. "Get off my property," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Now!" The 5 men turned to face him. Pritchard sneered. "We're just having a conversation with your hired help, Bennett. No need to get excited. That's not what it looks like from here," Thomas said, bringing the rifle to his shoulder. "Looks like 5 drunk cowards threatening a woman. I'll give you to the count of 3 to be back on those horses and riding away. You're going to shoot us over a squaw?" One of the strangers asked incredulously. "1," Thomas said, his finger moving to the trigger. "You're insane," Pritchard said. But he was backing toward his horse. 2. The men scrambled to mount, their earlier aggression evaporating in the face of Thomas's cold determination. As they wheeled their horses around, Pritchard shouted back, "This isn't over, Bennett! You're going to regret this." Thomas kept the rifle trained on them until they disappeared from view. Only then did he lower it, his hands shaking slightly with adrenaline. He turned to Nashota, who was sliding the knife back into a hidden sheath at her belt. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was tighter than usual. "They were drunk and stupid, but I could have handled them." "I don't doubt it," Thomas said, climbing the porch steps. "But you shouldn't have to." Nashota looked at him, something complicated in her expression. "This is what I meant when I said it wouldn't be easy. Those men came because I'm here. Because of what I am to you or what they think I am. It's going to keep happening. Then it keeps happening," Thomas said firmly. "And we keep dealing with it. Together." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Together," she agreed softly. The incident changed something between them. The careful distance they'd been maintaining seemed suddenly absurd in the face of real danger. That evening, instead of retreating to separate corners of the cabin as usual, they sat together on the porch as the sun set. "Tell me about the last 10 years, Thomas said. "Everything. What your life was like, what you learned, who you became." Nashota was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts. Then she began to speak, her voice painting pictures of a life Thomas could barely imagine. She told him about learning to process hides until her hands bled, about tracking deer through snow so deep she sometimes sank to her waist. She described the women who'd taught her, her aunt, who was patient and kind, an older woman named Dihya, who was stern but wise, a young cousin who'd become like a sister. She spoke about the men who'd wanted to marry her. The first was a warrior named Delshay. He was brave and handsome, and my uncle approved of him. He brought gifts, horses, fine blankets. But when I looked at him, I felt nothing. He wasn't you. The second was a man from another band, a skilled hunter. He promised to provide well for me, to honor my opinions, to let me have influence in his household. He was kind. I could have been content with him, I think. But content isn't enough when your heart already knows what it wants. "The third?" Thomas asked. "The third was my uncle's choice. He was older, widowed, with children who needed a mother. My uncle thought it would be practical, that I was being foolish, waiting for something that might never happen. We argued about it. What did you say?" Nashota smiled slightly. "I told him that I'd rather die alone than live a lie, that I'd learned from a white rancher what integrity looks like, and I wouldn't dishonor his teaching by settling for less than truth." My uncle was angry, but he couldn't argue with that logic. Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I never taught you anything." "You taught me everything," Nashota corrected gently. "You taught me that actions matter more than words. That honor isn't about following rules, but about doing what's right even when it's hard. You taught me that kindness isn't weakness, and that strength includes knowing when to be gentle." She turned to face him fully. "You saved my life, Thomas. But more than that, you showed me what kind of person I wanted to be. Every choice I've made since then has been measured against the standard you set. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Thomas did understand, and the weight of it was almost overwhelming. "I'm not the man you think I am. I'm just someone who did what anyone decent would have done. But most people aren't decent," Nashota said. "Most people would have walked away, or turned me over to authorities, or kept me out of obligation rather than care. You didn't do any of those things. You gave me a choice, respected my voice even when I was just a child, and let me go when I needed to be with my people. That's not ordinary, Thomas. That's exceptional." They sat in silence as darkness fell, the words hanging between them like a promise not quite made. Finally, Thomas spoke. "I'm afraid of failing you, of not being what you need, or what you think you need, of waking up 5 years from now and seeing regret in your eyes." "Then we make a different promise," Nashota said. "We promise to be honest with each other. If doubts come, we speak to them. If problems arise, we face them. We don't let resentment build or disappointment fester. Can you do that?" "I can try," Thomas said. "That's all anyone can do," Nashota replied. "Try and keep trying even when it's hard." She reached out and took his hand, and this time Thomas didn't pull away. They sat like that, hands intertwined, until the stars came out in their thousands across the desert sky. The next challenge arrived 10 days later in the form of a territorial marshal. William Crawford was a hard man in his 50s, who'd spent most of his career dealing with outlaws and frontier justice. He rode up to the ranch alone, which Thomas took as a good sign. If he'd come to arrest someone, he'd have brought deputies. "Mr. Bennett?" Crawford asked, dismounting. "I'm Marshal Crawford. I'd like a word if you have time." "Marshal," Thomas said, setting aside the fence post he'd been notching. "What brings you out this way?" "I've had complaints," Crawford said directly, "about you harboring an Indian woman illegally. Now, I checked the regulations, and there's no actual law being broken that I can see. But there are people in town who think otherwise, and they're causing enough noise that I had to come see the situation myself." Nashota emerged from the barn, leading one of the horses. She stopped when she saw the marshal, her expression neutral but watchful. Crawford studied her for a moment, then looked back at Thomas.
"That her?"
"That's Nashota," Thomas confirmed. "She works for me. Legitimate employment, fair wages, proper living arrangements. Is there a problem with that?" "Not legally," Crawford said slowly, "but practically. Bennett, you're stirring up trouble you might not be able to handle. There are people who want this woman gone, who'll use any excuse to make that happen. I'm trying to prevent violence, not cause it." "I appreciate that, Marshal," Thomas said carefully. "But Nashota has every right to be here. She's not a prisoner. She's not being exploited, and she's not causing any trouble. If people have a problem with that, the problem is theirs, not ours." Crawford sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." He looked at Nashota again. "Miss, do you understand that your presence here is causing friction? That there are people who want you removed from this property?" "I understand," Nashota said clearly. "I also understand that I'm breaking no laws and harming no one. I have as much right to work and live where I choose as any person." "In principle, yes," Crawford agreed. "But principle doesn't always protect you from prejudice." He turned back to Thomas. "Or have there been incidents?" Thomas hesitated, then decided honesty was better. 5 men came here drunk 2 weeks ago. Made threats. I sent them away. No violence occurred. Who were they? Thomas told him, and Crawford's expression darkened. "The Pritchard boy's a problem waiting to happen. I'll have words with him, but Bennett, you need to understand, I can't be here all the time. If things escalate, you might be on your own." "We'll manage," Thomas said. "See that you do," Crawford said, remounting. Before he rode off, he looked at Nashota one more time. "Miss, for what it's worth, I don't see anything wrong with what you're doing. But wrong and safe aren't always the same thing. You watch yourself." "I always do, Marshal," Nashota replied. After Crawford left, Thomas and Nashota stood together in the yard, processing the conversation. "That could have been worse," Thomas said finally. "It will get worse," Nashota predicted. "Men like Pritchard don't give up just because a marshal talks to them. They'll come back and they'll bring more people. Then we'll be ready," Thomas said. He looked at her seriously. "I need to teach you to shoot properly. That knife is good for close quarters, but if someone comes at you from a distance, you need another option. Over the next weeks, Thomas taught Nashota to handle firearms. She proved a natural shot, her steady hands and sharp eyes serving her well. They practiced in the evenings, setting up targets at various distances. Thomas taught her about rifle maintenance, about judging distance and wind, about when to shoot and when to hold fire. But they also practiced other things, their story if any one official questioned them, the nature of her employment, the terms of her compensation, the propriety of their living arrangements. They needed to be absolutely consistent if challenged. What do I say if they ask why I'm not on a reservation? Nashota asked one evening, "You say that your band was never formally assigned to a reservation, that they lived traditionally in the mountains with permission from the tribal council, and that you chose to seek employment off the reservation lands to learn skills that would help your people, all of which is true. And if they ask about us," she pressed, "about whether we're together?" Thomas met her eyes. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth," Nashota said simply, "that we're not together yet, but we're considering it, that we're taking time to navigate complicated circumstances, that our relationship is our business, not theirs." The yet in her statement hung in the air between them. Not together yet. The word implied inevitability, a future already written, just waiting for them to catch up to it. "Yet," Thomas repeated softly. "Yet," Nashota confirmed, and the look in her eyes made Thomas's heart race. The decisive moment came on a cold November morning. Thomas woke to the sound of cattle bellowing in distress. He dressed quickly and rushed outside to find Nashota already at the corral, staring toward the eastern pasture. Smoke rose in a thin column from that direction. "Someone's started a brush fire," she said grimly. "Upwind of your cattle," Thomas felt cold fury settle over him. This wasn't an accident or nature. This was deliberate. Someone was trying to stampede his herd, destroy his property, drive him into financial ruin. "We need to move the cattle north," he said, already running for the barn. "If that fire reaches the dry grass in the pasture, we'll lose everything." They worked with desperate efficiency, saddling horses and riding hard toward the eastern pasture. The fire was spreading faster than Thomas had feared, pushed by a steady wind, directly toward where most of his herd grazed. The cattle were already agitated, milling and starting to panic. "I'll circle around and push them from the south," Nashota shouted over the sound of frightened animals. "You take the north side and we'll channel them west." There was no time to argue or worry about her safety. Thomas nodded and spurred his horse in the opposite direction. For the next 2 hours, they fought to control the herd, pushing them away from the advancing fire and toward the safer ground of the western pasture. The smoke was thick and choking, the heat intense even at a distance. Several times steers broke away, and Thomas had to chase them down, his lungs burning. Through it all, he could see Nashota on the other side of the herd, working with the skill of someone born to it. She read the cattle's movements, anticipated where they'd break, positioned herself perfectly to turn them. She was magnificent. By the time they got the last of the cattle to safety, they were both covered in soot and ash, exhausted, their voices hoarse from shouting and smoke. The fire had consumed about 40 acres of grazing land, but had been stopped by a rocky area where there wasn't enough fuel to sustain it. Thomas dismounted on shaking legs and did a quick count. They'd lost 3 head, either to the fire or to predators that would find them later. It could have been so much worse. Nashota rode up beside him, and without thinking, Thomas reached up and pulled her from her horse into his arms. She came willingly, wrapping her arms around him, both of them trembling with exhaustion and relief. "You were incredible," Thomas said into her hair. "I couldn't have saved them without you." "We're partners," Nashota said simply. "That's what partners do." Thomas pulled back just enough to look at her face, smudged with soot, her eyes bright despite the exhaustion. "Nashota, I know," she interrupted gently. "You don't have to say it yet. But soon, Thomas. Soon you'll be ready. How are you so patient?" he asked wonderingly. "Because I know how this ends," she said, smiling. "I've known since I was 8 years old. I'm just waiting for you to figure it out, too. They rode back to the ranch as the sun set, exhausted but together. That night, Thomas lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, and finally admitted the truth to himself. He was going to marry Nashota. Not because of social pressure or obligation or guilt. Because she was right. They were partners in every way that mattered. The rest was just details to be worked out. The only question was when he'd find the courage to tell her what she already knew. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a cold that settled deep into the bones. Thomas spent the weeks following the fire investigating who'd set it, but the culprits had been careful. No witnesses, no clear evidence, just suspicions that pointed toward Pritchard and his associates but couldn't be proven. The fire had changed something in Thomas, burned away the last of his hesitation. He'd come within hours of losing everything he'd built, and the only reason he hadn't was because Nashota had been there beside him. She wasn't just someone living on his ranch anymore. She was the reason the ranch still stood. December brought the first significant snowfall, blanketing the ranch in white and forcing them to spend more time inside. Thomas used the enforced proximity to teach Nashota to read and write English beyond the basic words she already knew. She proved as quick with letters as she'd been with everything else, sitting beside him at the kitchen table in the evenings, practicing her penmanship by lamplight. "Why is English spelling so illogical?" she complained one night, frowning at the word through she'd just written. "The letters don't match the sounds." Because English borrowed from half a dozen other languages and never bothered to make things consistent, Thomas explained, smiling at her frustration. "You should see French spelling. It's even worse." "Do you speak French?" she asked, looking up with interest. "A little. My mother was originally from Quebec. She taught me some before she died." "Teach me," Nashota said immediately. "I want to learn everything you know." So their evenings expanded to include basic French phrases alongside English reading. Thomas found himself constantly surprised by Nashota's hunger for knowledge. She asked questions about history, geography, mathematics, subjects he'd half forgotten from his own limited schooling. When he couldn't answer, they'd discuss what might be true. Reasoning through problems together. "You should have been a teacher," Thomas said one night after she'd explained a mathematical concept in a way that finally made sense to him. "I am a teacher," Nashota replied. "I teach you patience every day." Thomas laughed and realized how often he'd been laughing lately. The ranch that had been so silent for years now rang with conversation, with shared observations and quiet jokes that only they understood. He'd forgotten what it felt like to have a companion, someone who made even mundane tasks feel lighter. Christmas approached, and Thomas made a decision. On a clear, cold morning, he rode into Prescott, larger and more developed than Granite Creek had ever been, and visited the jeweler's shop. The proprietor, a German immigrant named Wilhelm Schneider, greeted him with professional courtesy. "I need a ring," Thomas said without preamble. "For an engagement?" Schneider's eyebrows rose slightly. Clearly he'd heard the rumors about Thomas and the Apache woman, but his expression remained neutral. "Of course." "What did you have in mind?" Thomas described what he wanted. Simple but well made, a gold band with a small turquoise stone. "Turquoise is significant in Apache culture," he explained. "I want something that honors both worlds, hers and mine." "A thoughtful choice," Schneider said, pulling out several options. "Turquoise represents protection and good fortune in many traditions." Thomas selected a ring that felt right, elegant in its simplicity, with a stone the color of a clear desert sky. As Schneider wrapped it, he spoke carefully. "Mr. Bennett, forgive the presumption, but I feel I should mention there will be those who object to such a union." "I know," Thomas said. "And you're prepared for that?" Thomas met his eyes steadily. "I'm prepared to stand with the woman I love, regardless of who objects." "That's all the preparation needed." Schneider nodded slowly, a hint of approval in his expression. "Then I wish you every happiness. True love is rare enough in this world. It should be celebrated, not condemned." Thomas returned to the ranch with the ring burning a hole in his pocket, but he waited for the right moment. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow and a clear, star-filled sky. Thomas and Nashota prepared a modest celebration. A roasted chicken, potatoes, dried apple pie made from fruit they'd preserved in the fall. After dinner, they sat by the fire as they did most evenings, but Thomas felt different tonight. Nervous, excited, terrified. He'd faced down armed men without this level of fear, but somehow asking Nashota to marry him seemed infinitely more daunting. "You're quiet tonight," Nashota observed, watching him over her mug of coffee. "Something troubling you?" "Not troubling exactly," Thomas said. He set down his own mug and turned to face her fully. "Nashota, I need to tell you something." She straightened slightly, her expression becoming attentive. "I'm listening." Thomas took a breath. "When you first came back and told me you wanted to be my woman, I had 100 reasons why it was impossible. The age difference, the cultural divide, the social consequences, all of them seemed insurmountable. And now," she asked softly, "now I realize I was looking at it wrong. I was so focused on all the reasons it might fail that I couldn't see the one reason it would succeed." He reached out and took her hand. "You, Nashota, you're the reason. Your strength, your wisdom, your courage, your patience with a stubborn man who took way too long to catch up to what you already knew." Tears welled in her eyes, but she was smiling. "Thomas, wait, let me finish," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. "I'm not the man you think I am. I'm not some hero from a story. I'm just a rancher who's getting older, who has more scars than prospects, who can offer you a hard life with uncertain rewards. But I can offer you honesty, partnership, and a love that surprised me by how deep it runs." He pulled the ring from his pocket, and Nashota's breath caught. "I went to Prescott last week and had this made. The turquoise is for your people, the gold for mine. Like us, two different worlds coming together to make something new." He held it up, his hand only slightly trembling. "Nashota, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, face whatever comes together, and let me spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of the gift you're offering?" For a moment, Nashota just stared at the ring, tears now streaming freely down her face. Then she laughed, a sound of pure joy, and threw her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, Thomas, of course, yes. I told you I knew how this would end." Thomas held her close, feeling like something that had been broken inside him for years was finally healing. When they pulled apart, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the turquoise catching the firelight. "It's beautiful," Nashota whispered, holding her hand up to admire it. "Everything about this is beautiful." They sat together by the fire until the logs burned down to embers, making plans and promises, imagining a future that had seemed impossible just months ago. Thomas felt lighter than he had in years, as if he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't fully recognized until it was lifted. But he also knew their challenges weren't over. Getting married would make their relationship official and public, which meant facing opposition head-on rather than deflecting it with claims of mere employment. The next morning, Christmas Day, they rode together to the camp where Nashota's uncle's band was wintering. Thomas had sent word ahead through a trusted Apache man who occasionally traded at his ranch, so Cocheta was expecting them. The camp was nestled in a protected valley, arranged in a rough circle with a larger central fire. Children played in the snow, while women worked on various tasks and men sat in small groups, talking or maintaining weapons and tools. Several people looked up as Thomas and Nashota approached, their expressions ranging from curious to wary. Cocheta emerged from his wickiup, his weathered face unreadable. Thomas dismounted and helped Nashota down, then stood respectfully while Cocheta approached. "Uncle," Nashota said in Apache, then switched to English so Thomas could understand. "We've come to ask for your blessing." She held up her left hand, showing the ring. Cocheta's eyes fixed on it, then moved to Thomas's face. "You wish to marry my niece?" "I do," Thomas said firmly. "I love her, and I'll spend my life trying to give her the future she deserves." Cocheta was silent for a long moment. Then he gestured for them to follow him to his wickiup. Inside, away from curious eyes, he sat and motioned for them to do the same. When you took Nashota as a child, I was suspicious, Cochetta said bluntly. I watched your ranch for days before revealing myself, making sure you had not harmed her. What I saw convinced me you were a man of honor. Thank you, Thomas said. But marriage is different from rescue, Cochetta continued. Marriage means joining two families, two peoples. It means children who will belong to both worlds and to neither. It means hardship from both sides. Your people will judge her. My people will judge you. Are you truly ready for this? I don't know if anyone can be truly ready for something like this, Thomas admitted. But I know I want to try. I know that without Nashota my life is empty. And I know that I'd rather face a hard future with her than an easy one without her. Cochetta turned to Nashota. And you, niece? You could marry within the tribe, live among your people, raise children who would know their heritage without question. Why choose this difficult path? Because he saved my life and asked nothing in return, Nashota said simply. Because he treats me as an equal when much of the world sees me as less than human. Because he makes me want to be braver, stronger, better. And because my heart chose him 10 years ago, Uncle, I'm just following where it leads. Cochetta studied them both, then reached into a leather pouch at his belt. He pulled out 2 small items, a beautifully beaded leather cord and a single eagle feather. He handed the cord to Nashota and the feather to Thomas. In our tradition, he said, marriage requires exchange of gifts that symbolize what each person brings to the union. Nashota, this cord was made by your grandmother. It represents the strength and skill of the women in your line. Give it to Thomas as a symbol of the connection he's making to your family. Nashota took the cord reverently and tied it around Thomas's wrist. Her fingers gentle. Thomas, Cochetta continued. This feather represents courage and vision, the ability to see far and fly high. It's given to warriors who prove themselves worthy. By accepting Nashota into your life, you've shown both courage and vision. Wear it with honor. Thomas accepted the feather, moved beyond words. Nashota helped him secure it in his hatband. You have my blessing, Cochetta said. Not because I think this path will be easy, it won't be. But because I see that you both understand what you're choosing and are willing to fight for it. That's all any marriage can ask for. They spent the rest of the day at the camp, sharing a meal and hearing stories from Nashota's extended family. Thomas felt welcomed in a way he hadn't expected. Accepted, not in spite of being white, but simply as the man Nashota had chosen. Several of the elders offered advice, some practical, some spiritual, all given with genuine care. As they prepared to leave, a young woman about Nashota's age approached. You were right to choose love, she said quietly in English. I hope you find happiness, cousin. Nashota embraced her. Thank you. That means more than you know. The ride back to the ranch was quiet but comfortable, both of them processing the significance of what had just happened. As the cabin came into view, Thomas felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was home, and Nashota was who made it that way. When should we marry? Thomas asked as they unsaddled the horses. Soon, Nashota said. Before winter makes travel too difficult. Before people have time to organize opposition. Before either of us can second-guess what we know is right. New Year's Day? Thomas suggested. A new year, a new life together. Perfect, Nashota agreed. They spent the next week preparing. Thomas visited Reverend Caldwell, knowing the conversation would be difficult but necessary. The Reverend proved every bit as opposed as expected, citing scripture and social conventions and dire warnings about the consequences of mixing races. I'm not asking your permission, Thomas said firmly. I'm informing you that I'll be married on New Year's Day. You can perform the ceremony or not. That's your choice. But it's happening regardless. Caldwell's face reddened with anger. Then you'll do it without the church's blessing and without mine. Don't come crying to me when this all falls apart. Thomas left without another word. Instead, he arranged for Justice of the Peace, William Anderson, to perform the ceremony. Anderson was a practical man who cared more about legal formalities than social conventions. If you're both of age and entering into this freely, I see no reason to refuse, he said simply. Word of the impending marriage spread through Prescott quickly. Reactions were mixed. Some people expressed outright hostility, refusing to do business with Thomas or making pointed comments about race mixing and savages. Others were supportive, or at least neutral, willing to let Thomas live his life as he saw fit. Sarah Pritchard, the schoolteacher, surprised Thomas by visiting the ranch 3 days before the wedding. "I wanted to meet you," she said directly. "My brother's actions have shamed our family. And I want you to know, not all of us share his prejudices." She and Nashota talked for over an hour, discussing books and teaching methods and the challenges of life in the territory. When Sarah left, she pressed a small package into Nashota's hands. "A wedding gift. Just some nice fabric for a dress. Every bride deserves something special to wear. Thank you," Nashota said, genuinely touched. "Your kindness means more than you know." New Year's Day dawned clear and cold. Thomas wore his best suit, the eagle feather still in his hatband, the leather cord visible at his wrist. Nashota had made a dress that combined traditional Apache designs with settler styles, white cotton with intricate beadwork at the collar and cuffs. Beautiful in its simplicity, they were married in the main room of Thomas's cabin with only a handful of witnesses: Justice Anderson, Sarah Pritchard, Jacob Morrison from the general store, and Sheriff Garrett, who'd become an unexpected ally. Gojeta and 3 other Apache were also present, standing silently in the back but making their support clear. The ceremony was brief. Anderson read the legal requirements, asked the necessary questions, and pronounced them married under territorial law. There was no music, no elaborate ritual, no crowd of well-wishers. But as Thomas slipped a simple gold band onto Nashota's finger beside her engagement ring, and as she placed one on his, the moment felt sacred in a way no elaborate ceremony could have matched. "I promise to stand beside you," Thomas said quietly, his vows simple but heartfelt. "In good times and bad, when the world supports us and when it opposes us. I promise to honor your heritage, respect your voice, and love you with everything I have. I promise to be your partner," Nashota replied, her voice strong despite the tears in her eyes. "To build with you, fight beside you, and remind you every day that you're more than you think you are. I promise to bring both our worlds together in our home. To honor where we both came from, while creating something new together." They kissed, sealing promises that went far deeper than the legal document Anderson had them sign. The small group of witnesses offered congratulations, and Morrison surprised them with a cake he'd brought from town, a small gesture of support that meant everything. After the witnesses left, Cochetta approached them. "You will face difficult times," he said solemnly. "People will test you, circumstances will challenge you, but you have something many couples never find. You have chosen each other with open eyes and honest hearts. Hold on to that when things get hard." "We will, Uncle," Nashota promised. Embracing him, after Cocheta and his companions departed, Thomas and Nashota stood together on the porch, watching the sun set on the first day of their married life. The ranch stretched out before them, the land they'd now tend together, the life they'd build as partners. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked, pulling her close against the cold. "I've been happy since the moment you said yes," Nashota replied, leaning into him. "But this is more than happiness. This is rightness. Like everything in my life finally makes sense." Thomas understood exactly what she meant. For years, he'd been building something out here, a ranch, a reputation, a life, but it had all felt slightly hollow, like constructing a house no one would ever live in. Now with Nashota beside him, it all had purpose. "What do you think our life will look like in 10 years?" he asked. Nashota was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we'll have expanded the ranch, built something truly impressive. I think we'll have faced opposition and overcome it. I think we'll have taught each other 1,000 things we didn't know. And I think we'll have created a home where both Apache and white people feel welcome, where our different worlds don't clash but complement each other." "Children?" Thomas asked tentatively. "Maybe," Nashota said, smiling up at him. "If we're blessed with them. Children who'll belong to both peoples, who'll carry the best of both traditions forward, who'll prove that love can bridge any divide." That sounds perfect, Thomas said. It sounds complicated and difficult and beautiful, Nashota corrected. But then, so are all the best things in life. They stood together as stars began appearing in the darkening sky, neither of them in any hurry to go inside. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new obstacles to overcome. But they'd face them together, partners in every sense that mattered. Thomas thought back to that day 10 years ago when he'd found a terrified child hiding in a canyon, injured and alone. He could never have imagined then that she'd grow into the remarkable woman now standing beside him, or that saving her life would end up saving his in ways he hadn't known he needed. "What are you thinking?" Nashota asked, sensing his mood. "I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest man alive," Thomas said honestly. "And I'm thinking that whatever comes next, we'll handle it together." "Together," Nashota echoed. And in that single word was everything they needed: promise, partnership, and a future being written with each choice they made. The desert wind whispered across the ranch, carrying the scent of juniper and sage. Inside the cabin, their cabin now, a fire crackled in the hearth. The life they'd built separately was becoming the life they'd build together. And though the path ahead was uncertain, they walked it with confidence born of love, respect, and an unshakable commitment to each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.